Welcome to Hacking Your ADHD. I'm your host, William Kerb, and I have ADHD. On this podcast, I dig into the tools, tactics, and best practices to help you work with your ADHD brain. Hey team, while AI has become a buzzword that has lost much of its meaning, there are still many use cases that can help with our ADHD. One of the places that I have been enjoying exploring is how I can outsource some of my executive functions to these applications so that I can save my brain for the important stuff. In today's episode, we'll first examine what executive function is so that we know what we're really working with here. Then we'll explore a number of tools that we can use, from large language models to tools to help with your calendars and even smaller tools fit for goblins. Also, before we get into anything about AI, I do want to make a quick disclaimer about some of the ethics with using these tools and also how they were created. While these tools can be great in assisting with what we create, it's also important that we're still doing our own work and not passing off what an LLM did as our work. I have been using some of these tools to help create episodes and even cite some of the ways I'm doing so in this episode. But what I'm not doing is feeding a prompt into an LLM and just using that. That would be lazy, irresponsible, and not something that anyone wants. However, just because I'm not doing that doesn't mean that other people aren't. This is something to particularly look out for with new books about ADHD that aren't coming from established authors or creators. Additionally, there are ethical concerns about how the training data for many LLMs was obtained. This is especially a concern in regards to the lack of consent used to source this material. This has been seen more in terms of art and how those models are trained without the artist's knowledge, but it also applies to the written word. While I still have been using these systems, I think it's important that we encourage more ethical sourcing of training data and only using data with consent. If you'd like to follow along with the show notes page, you can find that at hackingyyouradhd.com/192. All right, keep on listening to find out how you can outsource some of your executive function. To get started, we need to ensure that we understand exactly what we're talking about when we refer to executive functions. Simply put, these are the mental skills that help us plan, manage ourselves, and respond to situations. They're the brain's control center, guiding how we handle everything from organizing a task to reacting in the moment. You can think of them as tools we rely on when we're not just coasting on autopilot. Dr. Russell Barkley, a leading expert on ADHD, explains that executive functions are closely tied to self-regulation, the ability to manage our behavior, emotions, and thoughts in pursuit of long-term goals. In fact, Dr. Barkley argues that ADHD is fundamentally a disorder of self-regulation rooted deeply in the deficits of executive functions. This is an important distinction we can work from because, unfortunately, there is no consensus on what an executive function actually is. I know, given how ubiquitous the term has become, this seems wild to me. But if we can see that the difficulties with executive functions are one and the same as the difficulties with self-regulation, we have much firmer ground on which to stand. That said, we can still use some of the language of executive function as we move forward. We typically draw from three core executive functions: working memory, cognitive flexibility, and inhibitory control. These mental processes help us retain information, adapt to new situations, and resist impulses. Working memory is our very short-term memory, the stuff that we're actively holding in our minds while we work with it. It's supposed to help us keep track of information while we're doing something else, like following a step-by-step recipe. For many of us with ADHD, working memory is one of the hardest things that we deal with. We start cooking that recipe, glance down at the first step, then we walk over to grab the next ingredient, and somehow we have no idea what we were supposed to be looking for, even though it was clear in our mind seconds ago. That's working memory in action, or perhaps more accurately here, inaction. Cognitive flexibility can mean the creative thinking and thinking outside the box, but it also refers to our ability to adapt to things when they don't go as planned. Sure, a lot of us with ADHD excel in creativity, but when dealing with the unexpected, well, I know personally that can depend on the severity of the situation. Getting a couple of unplanned free hours, well, I guess I'm not doing anything. But if things go really wrong, hey, I might be your man. Inhibitory control is about resisting temptation and not acting impulsively. It's what helps us maintain focus on what's important and block out distractions, like ignoring the ticking of a clock during a test or staying engaged in a conversation instead of focusing on a TV on the other side of the restaurant. Executive functions are not just about managing tasks in the moment either. They're crucial for long-term success and goal attainment. When I'm trying to work on a new episode, I have to resist a lot of other distractions like playing video games, and that's my executive functions that help me resist the urge to indulge, reminding me of my longer-term goals. This self-regulation involves a series of mental actions, like refocusing, reminding myself why I shouldn't give in, and visualizing my future success. For someone with ADHD, these self-directed actions are often weakened or delayed, making it much harder to stay on track. And this is going to be key when we get into these tools that can help us with this self-regulation aspect. Deficits in executive function can have a major impact on our ability to self-regulate. This is why things like managing time and thinking about the future can be so tough. It makes it hard to plan ahead, anticipate what's coming, and then stay on track with our goals. It's also important to know that executive function deficits aren't exclusive to ADHD. And in fact, executive dysfunction isn't part of the ADHD diagnostic criteria in the DSM-5. However, there's such a significant overlap here that it's hard to imagine an ADHD diagnosis without at least some executive function challenges. So, while it's not an official part of the diagnosis, I believe it's crucial to consider when we're trying to manage our ADHD. And all that just to get to what we're talking about with executive functions. But I think it's an important starting point because when we're looking for tools, we want to think about what they are solving for. It's easy to see the shiny new tool and think, yeah, that's the one, that's going to solve everything. But if it's not really addressing the issue we're having, well, then that's not going to be the right tool. I don't want to get too much on my horse here also, but before we dive into the idea of AI tools, I want to mention that AI has become a buzzword, as I mentioned in the intro, and that it's lost quite a bit of its meaning. A lot of the stuff that is claiming to be AI-driven now is really just using some basic automation with maybe a sprinkling of smart features in there. I mean, even with large language models, when you interact with the model, it analyzes the input you provided, calculates the most likely sequence of words that should follow, and then generates coherent responses based on those probabilities. It operates by recognizing patterns and correlations from its training data rather than possessing true comprehension or awareness. And I'm putting this here just to remind everyone that these technologies have many limitations, and it's important that you're not just blindly following what it produces. None of these AI tools are thinking in any capacity, and it's quite easy for them to lead you off in the wrong direction if you're not paying attention. So with that in mind, I think the first thing we're going to want to be looking at here are some simple ways that we can use AI to assist with planning. One of the easiest places to start with is one of the popular large language models, LLMs, such as ChatGPT, Claude, Llama, or Gemini. There are also a ton of different other models out there, and some of them work better than others for various tasks, but really just go with the one you're most comfortable with. I like using these tools because they allow me to create easier starting points. One of the things I notice about my ADHD is that I'm better working from something that already exists than from a blank page. So, for example, I can load up my LLM of choice and ask it, can you help me plan a packing list for a 7-day trip to the Oregon coast? And it will come up with a pretty decent list. But where I find making these models really shine is not from what they initially provide, but from asking the model to then ask me questions. So I could follow up that initial query with, can you ask me 5 questions that would improve the quality of that packing list? And now we've got something that is really going to narrow down what we're doing. And as a bonus here, I also like asking the model to ask me questions one at a time so I don't get overwhelmed with too many questions right away. This also works great for planning out your week. Just go with a prompt such as, I'd like help planning my week. Can you ask me a series of questions that will determine what my most important tasks are, and making sure that I don't get overwhelmed by doing too much each day? Please ask me these questions one at a time. And boom! After working through the questions, you've got a template for how you might want your week to go. Now, I want to be clear, this is not a foolproof process, but I think this gives us a great starting point where we don't have to invest a lot of mental effort into getting started. I personally just kind of like using these features with the ChatGPT app on my phone because I can just do it while I'm sitting there and eating my breakfast. The most important part to take away here, though, is the idea of having the LLM ask you questions. We want to view it as an assistant that is helping us, not something that's making something new. To this end, if I have trouble coming up with my own prompts, you can also ask the LLM for assistance with that as well. Go with something like, I want to write a prompt that will help me organize a project at work. Can you ask me 5 questions that will help me define the scope of my problem and then write a prompt that I can use to structure my project plan? And here's a fun thing. I was struggling to come up with an example for what I wanted to fill in there. So I took that paragraph and I started with the prompt, can you help me fill in the blanks here with a few examples? And then the examples that came up with me were things like brainstorming ideas for a blog post, organizing a project, crafting a social media strategy, preparing a presentation, or improving a business process. I felt like the project organization one fit best for this example. And that's why I love using these services for. It gives me options. I don't want them to try and do the actual work for me because, well, for one, I still want to produce my own work. But also, these systems don't know the difference between what's good and bad. So you can end up with some extremely crappy work. But using them as an assistant to what you're already doing can be incredibly beneficial for saving brain power. The most important thing to remember with these systems is that bad inputs will always give you bad output. The more specific you can make your prompt, the better off you will be. However, this doesn't let you off the hook from checking those answers and making sure that the model isn't just hallucinating something. And that last point is incredibly salient. Remember that these are imperfect tools, and using them is not a replacement for doing research. Don't just accept answers at face value. Check the work. Moving beyond large language models, there are a lot of other tools that we can look to help with planning. One of the tips that I often talk about is how if you can break a task down into its more component parts, it makes it a lot easier to get started. When we're looking at the bigger picture, it can be overwhelming to get started. But just a piece of it can be a lot easier to get our minds around. But there are a lot of us that can get stuck in that breaking down of a task. Fortunately, there are some great AI tools that can help here, like Goblin Tools, which does just that. You enter a task, and it will break it down into smaller pieces. And in fact, if that smaller piece still feels too big, you can ask it to further break down that piece. Additionally, on these fronts, there's tools like Todoist and Microsoft To Do that have features that go beyond just being a digital checklist. With AI features, they can help you prioritize tasks based on deadlines, importance, and even your own productivity patterns. Trello and Asana can be great for project planning. Their AI features can help map out the steps needed for you to reach your goals, set deadlines, and visualize your progress. They can even suggest which tasks to tackle first based on your deadlines and workload. Tools like Clockwise and Reclaim AI can automatically schedule your tasks into your calendar, making sure that you have dedicated time to work on what's important. For working memory support, tools like Otter AI or Scribe are AI note-taking tools that can automatically transcribe meetings, conversations, or verbal instructions. Additionally, I use Grammarly to help tighten up my writing. While the spelling and grammar help is great, the ability to make sure that what I'm writing is clear and concise is fantastic. However, I will say it can be a little too aggressive in what it corrects sometimes, and I worry that it's cutting out a bit of my voice from what I'm writing. But that's why I don't have to follow all of its suggestions. As I mentioned earlier, the most important part of using these tools is making sure that they actually address what we need them to. While there is no problem with having some fun and playing around with these tools and seeing what they can do, they can also become an obstacle in their own right. To this end, I also want to mention that I don't personally use most of these tools. With my current workflows, I can usually get what works best for me by using ChatGPT. But I also thought it would be good to mention a number of other ways that we can jump into this idea of using AI to help with our executive function needs. And before we finish up, I just also want to reiterate to use caution when using these tools. While they can sometimes provide good starting points, we shouldn't expect them to replace the work we're doing. Thanks for sticking with me all the way to the end. Before you go, though, let's do a quick rundown of today's top tips. 1. We can better understand executive function through the lens of self-regulation. There are 3 core areas that we can look at here: working memory, cognitive flexibility, and inhibitory control. 2. Tools like LLMs can help us create starting points for our work. By prompting the LLM to ask us questions instead, it can also help us better think through our thought processes. 3. When looking to add a new tool to your repertoire, think about what the problem is you're going to be solving for, rather than just looking for the newest shiny thing, and then make sure that this new tool is going to address that problem. Alright, that's it. Thanks for listening. I'd love to hear what you thought of this episode. Feel free to connect with me over at hackingYourADHD.com/contact. If you'd like links or to read this episode's transcript, you can go to the show notes page at hackingYourADHD.com/192. I also wanted to let you know about the Hacking Your ADHD newsletter, Any and All Distractions. In it, I bring you the top things of the week that have caught my attention from the world of ADHD and beyond. If that sounds like something you'd like in your inbox, just head over to hackingYourADHD.com/newsletter and sign up. And now for your moment of dad. Why was the baby jalapeno pepper shivering? He was a little chilly.